setup, just as Christine has done herself.
So, we have just seen how a pragmatic approach can be applied to reading practice. I will now try to apply the same approach to book production and try to see how it may contribute to editorial practice and aesthetic studies. I understood the interest of a pragmatic approach when I observed the gap between the 1950s critical edition of Christine de Pizan's Mutation de Fortune and the reality of the autograph manuscript on which the edition is based. Here we see the tree which the editor uses to illustrate the relationships between the 7 original codices. It conceptualizes 2 versions of the text according to textual evidence, such as variants. By taking into account the circumstances involved in the production of the manuscript, I was able to question this text-oriented vision. More often than not, this present chronologies or genealogies, but not new graphs, maps, and trees, which in our case allow us to rethink the fluid nature of medieval text. Take this real-looking graph, for instance. Although it is actually work in progress, it permits us to think outside the traditional box. Here we have the different material data of the 7 original manuscripts: miniatures, decorations, paragraphs, titles, tables, corrections. Normally, in traditional philological vision, a codex is an isotopic object. Let us say that all these aspects will have been produced at the same time. This is true for manuscripts M, E, and F. Whereas in manuscripts B, H, S, C, this is not the case, because the state of the exemplar that they copy is not the same for the miniature, decoration, paragraphs, titles, tables, correction. For instance, let's take the case of the B manuscript, where the text, the miniatures, the decoration, the paragraphs, the titles have been copied and produced from the first version of the yellow on the graph. Whereas the tables and the corrections depend on the second or even the third version. So actually, B is not isotopic, because a different production operation were not executed from the same version of the mutation. Moreover, in each step of this production operations, we see that they are not executed uniformly. Let's take the transcription of the text of the B manuscript. We can see that the transcription was interrupted, which is textually visible, but also materially visible. For instance, let's look at the difference of ink used to trace the text and the handwriting, notably in the tracing of capital P and in the tracing of the D. Because we see that the proportion of unshelled D decreases totally in the last book, as this graph shows. We can also observe that the catchwords are not written in the same way, since only those of the last part are calligraphed while the lettering was being copied, whereas those of the first books are traced in cursive and apparently at the time of the assembly of the letterings. In this configuration, how can we hope to choose a version to edit? According to our conception, what may facilitate the editorial choices, more than traditional text-oriented vision, philology, is the return to the codex. 5 quick examples will show just this. First, at verse 11, 332 of manuscript E of the Mutation, the philologist will find a graphic particularity which he will hesitate to correct. Cité for cité. Now, the copyist had indeed noticed this and visibly considered this spelling as atypical, which is why he placed a workshop note in margin. This note may have served as a recall to correct the text at that point. The editor who overlooks this note will edit cité and will bring linguists to panic and frantically add this particular spelling to their dictionaries. The same thing happens at the first of the 400 autograph folios of Queen manuscript RD 4431, where the author does indeed operate a mistake for the visual reading, but we can explain it by the context of writing. Christian means to write toute voix with a Y, but yet to write toute voix with a I, so that our text is not swallowed by the space of the decoration. Another example of the contribution of archaeology to philology can be seen in the Avison Christine edition. The editor had to correct many more mistakes corresponding to chapters 21 to 27. In fact, this passage has the same proportion of mistakes and corresponds to gatherings 73 to 79, which is in turn the same proportion of mistakes that the author gets in the gatherings of the Codex. The reason for this high proportion of mistakes from an editorial point of view is that this gathering was much less read than the other gatherings. This explains why the editor must intervene more often, but not do so with sense and sensibility. Moreover, paleographic analysis is primordial to operate a distinction between the work of the author and that of its collaborators, which is sometimes faulty. Let's look, for instance, at verse 795 of Christine's Débat de deux Amants. In it, we notice a hypermetric verse, read with an extra syllable, in the French 1835 manuscript of the Bibliothèque nationale de France. When we focus on the Codex, we observe that this correction was executed by a collaborator on the basis of an editorial preparation. A last example to show how examination in reading rooms permits us to better apprehend the transmission of the text. What happened here, as you can see, is that a bit of wax must have leaked from a candle that was used to write. What does it mean? Well, it may be some interest for scholars to know, to remember that Christine wrote at night, she is for the morning, and sometimes she wrote it so quickly that she was able to complete 8 folios in one single day. As we can see in this autograph note at the title of folio 26 at the beginning of the gathering. Ci commence un pays écrit en un jour très doux, which means here begins a gathering transcribed completely in one day. It may therefore not be surprising to find a greater proportion of errors in this passage. Let me finally try to show how pragmatic study of Middle French may facilitate not only editorial practice, but also aesthetic study, and especially the context may explain the author's intention in relation to his text. For instance, the perception of textual progress between the first and the second version of the Mutation, based on the edition textual variants, can be confirmed by archaeology. In fact, you observe unidentified parchment marks in a couple margins in the 4 manuscripts of the so-called first version. Although we are not sure what these marks stand for, they seem to point to the fact that the purchase and the publishing project of the books was made simultaneously. Here is another one example, somewhat anecdotal but nevertheless relevant, which was actually uncovered by our director Tony Van Merek. In fact, on folio 31 of manuscript B of the Mutation, the editor transcribes the verse of the text without picking up on a personal note that the author copyist inscribes in a passage where she vows her eternal love for her dead husband. This is what we can see in the caddle at the beginning of her text. So it is Mon cœur avait, motto, which means my heart you have. Surprisingly, or not so surprisingly enough, such an inscription can be found today on 15th century wedding ring inscriptions.
I'll just conclude briefly to say just this. What we observe is that the transmission of knowledge and of the texts